Hey, everybody. Welcome to Unwriting the Bible. Just got done talking with Dr. Tom Steffen. If you don't know who Tom is, Dr. Tom Steffen is Professor Emeritus of Intercultural Studies at the Cook School of Intercultural Studies at Biola University. He served with New Tribes Mission, now known as Ethnos 360, for 20 years, including about 15 years in the Philippines, where he focused on church planting and cross-cultural ministry. Dr. Steffen specializes in church multiplication, orality, honor-shame dynamics, and business as mission. He's a leading voice in the biblical orality movement, contributing to development and application in missions and theological education. His publications include Reconnecting God's Story to Ministry, Worldview-based Storying, New and Old Horizons in the Orality Movement, and Passing the Baton. Man, we just had a really good talk about the dynamics of oral traditional cultures and how humans relate with each other and share stories and engage and embody truth, and how this conversation of orality and oral traditional cultures helps process not just how to read the Bible, but how to proclaim its message to the world. So I hope you enjoy this conversation at least half as much as I did. And looks like we're going. All right, Dr. Tom Steffen, welcome to Unwriting the Bible. I'm so excited to chat with you today.
I love that title, Unwriting the Bible. That is a classic, okay?
Oh, I'm so glad. I love it too. I was afraid it might get me in trouble. Uh,
Yeah,
some people don't.
it will for some people, but the rest of us will be very happy because of it.
Yeah, the Bible's got to be unwritten so that it can be alive in our hearts.
Yeah.
Um, I guess I could have put transliterating the Bible. But then
No,
that's too much. Just too much.
too scholarly.
Well, we talked a little bit before I hit the record button about where we might start, and really, Tom, it really was the email that you sent me. Um, the first email you said, "Hey, I got your book, and I'm gonna look at it to maybe to do a review, and I'm coming at this from the mission field, and then you sent me like two books of yours, and I started looking through it, and it really was that opened my mind to the fact that this whole conversation on oral tradition, on orality, that exploded in the 60s, that there really are, like, kind of parallel conversations going on. After I was introduced to the whole idea, by Paul Eddy's book, on the Synoptic Gospels, the easiest avenue for me to find was in biblical performance criticism, because that was coming out of SBL, and I was looking at David Rhodes and then other people who were talking about, well, when we perform the text, that changes the way that we hear it, the way that we experience it. We're gonna map, like audibly map the text, so we hear, what does the flow of the sound do rhetorically for um interpretation or whatever, and so that, and then it was actually, I was talking, Dr. Tremper Longman III came and spoke at my school, and I just asked him if he had any direction to give me, and he directed me to David Carr, and then that and another recommendation from my supervisor just launched me into the approach that is really launched out of Foley, and this comparative approach to biblical criticism, looking at, what has orality studies done for our study of Homer, of other ancient Near Eastern documents, and so how does this apply to biblical criticism, redaction criticism, source criticism, and all that stuff? But I didn't really understand those as different streams, and then when you said, hey man, I'm all about orality too from the mission field. And then I was like, what? And then I started seeing there's these conversations going on, and I'm excited about this kind of being a place where these conversations can come and intersect and bump up against each other, and we can learn more. So I would love to hear your how did you get in this conversation where orality is kind of like your thing now. I mean, you've written books about it. I mean, it's, um, like, yeah, how did you get into this conversation? And I would love to hear like even the flow of the how it impacted the mission field.
Okay. What a story.
Yeah. And you have to have a book on that topic too. So
Yeah. Um, it goes back. We were with New Tribes Mission at that time, and which is now Ethnos 360. And went to the Philippines to work there with a couple from my denominational background was with SIL, Summer Institute of Linguistics, who was doing the Bible translation for our particular group of Ifugao. There's like 6 dialects.
and
And
this is like the 70s, right? The 1970s?
yeah, 70s,
Yeah.
1970s. And so we went there in 71 to the Philippines, studied Tagalog, which is the national language. And we did that because all the Filipino language, unlike most countries, are very similar grammatically. So if you know one, it's very easy to switch over to the other one.
Mm.
And of course, some of our dialect had been written down, but it was more for the translation purposes and for learning it.
Mhm.
Per So, that's why we study Tagalog, and then you have that framework in your mind, you just go makes adaptations grammatically, and then you're good to go.
Mm.
And so, within 10 months, I was able to pretty much handle conversations like we're doing here, not quite the depth that I would have that you and I would have now, but within a year, I was really pretty far along in the language, so but and the culture, we studied the culture as well. And so we were invited up there by the SIL couple. They were, but that at that time they had 1/5 of the New Testament translated. That was it. So it was pretty early in the ball game, and which was really good. Um, so our job was to do the church planning side, which would also incorporate some. Um, there, there were no roads in there, no electricity. Okay, so we used aircraft to get in and out.
Wow.
Piper Cub, Helio Courier.
Wow.
Our our airstrip was 479 feet long, okay? So, if you know anything about aircraft, that's really short, and if you overshot it, you went into somebody's house, okay? So,
This is like the Wild West of this is the mission field. Yeah.
this is the mission
Yeah.
field, yes. Yeah, they were an animistic group with a Roman Catholic veneer,
Mhm.
okay? And so our job was to do the church planning, which incorporated some literacy and a lot of medical work because we were the only medical people there. They had, of course, their own shamans, right, who did everything.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But, we offered other stuff and, of course, and that was very instrumental in helping bring them to Christ over the years.
Mhm.
Um, so that was the
Mhm.
job. So, okay, so fast forward now, I'm starting to have meetings with them. We always had meetings, always had them at night. These are very industrious people. When it's daytime, they're working, okay?
Yeah.
They work the rice terraces. If you've not seen them, you need to look at the Banawi rice terraces, and that'll give you a picture. They're one of the wonders of the world. These are all hand carved. It's wet rice, so they go to the highest source of water, start to carve them down, and like that, and the water goes down through that, waters their rice fields all the way down to the rivers or streams below.
Wow.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, you have to be able to look at that and see, okay, they don't have any, is this level? They just look at it, right? And they make it level.
Yeah.
Because if it's not level, the water's gonna flow out, okay? So, but those rice terraces are just I call them stair steps to the skies, and that's what they are, just beautiful. And so and that's why they made the airstrip, and I kid you not, they had like 120 people doing that in one day, and you could almost watch it take shape. It was just
Wow. So fast. Yeah.
it has a 12% slope on it, and then a 21% slope right on the turnaround on the top.
Wow.
There's a all kinds of stories I could tell you about that, but we'll move on.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing what people can do. We don't. Yeah, we get so stuck, dependent on our tools. We don't realize.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
No, no, they were human tools and water buffalo, and between all those, they just moved the dirt like it was like moving sand.
wow.
And this is great, okay?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yep. Um, so fast forward now, I'm starting to teach, right? And getting it seriously into it. And I'm teaching on components of God, right? My background
Yeah, yeah.
tells you a little bit about the background of how you were
Sure, yeah.
approaching.
Bring that systematic theology to the yeah.
Yeah. Just lay it out there, right?
All right.
And of course, as I was laying it out there, you teach as you were taught, right? So that's what I was doing.
Sure.
And I'm looking at the faces out there, right? And I know enough about the culture now that, you know, I was not communicating. And you'd see little conversations going on over here, and you'd see people with the funny looks on their faces, and okay, this is not working.
Yeah.
All right. I realized that a propositional approach to these people is not going to work. Interestingly, we had a lot of great anthropological teaching before we came in our training program. That was really when Jacob Lowen and those guys the anthropologists were bringing missions together with anthropology. And we were fortunate enough to have that background, except we didn't get much into the how do people learn. That was it was assumed they learn like we learn, so you just go do what you do, right? And in the Ifugao, very respectfully, but Ifugao talk, okay, they let you know it's very shame-oriented culture, but they're not afraid to let you know that you're not communicating. So, the next time, we went out to Baguio, which is about a 25-minute flight away, and it's a small city, and it's where the US had a base there during World War II, still was there, and so but they have a Bible bookstore there, and so I went and I bought comic books, English comic books, and I brought it back and I put the Clay dialect over the English. I started using those to show and tell the story, and it was like, "Oh my gosh, grandma's telling the story, kids are telling the story, adults are telling the story." It's like, "What how did I ever miss this?" So I started to learn that there was a story approach to this thing that I had entirely missed. I didn't have a framework in which how I would do my evangelism or how I would do that type of stuff with discipleship and anything, because we're starting from scratch. So we're starting with the evangelism. I was trying to figure out how will I do this? Who were the characters that I would use to start to teach evangelism out of this? Okay. Going on at the same time down on the island of Palawan, which is south and west of on the it's on the border of the Philippines. It's a long, thin island. In the south, you have the Moros, the Muslim group, and you have animistic groups all the way through there from the north to south, tribal groups. And so we had this was clear in the 50s, late 50s, somewhere in that. You had an American missionary who went down there and he did evangelism using basically English and a few words of Palomano. And all of a sudden, he realized they all want to become Christians. That's interesting. Okay. And so, okay, well, you didn't need to get rid of your amulets. Okay, throw them in the stream. They did that. You need to get baptized. Everybody's getting baptized. And actually, they were running through the mountains to their families and baptizing them. Wow. Wow. How long was it? Wow, we got a really good people movement going on here.
Yeah.
The only problem was he didn't know the mythology or any of the culture. Okay.
Nah.
and, and one of the myths that they had was if somebody comes carrying a black book, do whatever he says.
Huh. Interesting.
He gets out of the canoe, right? The banca. He gets out of the banca carrying his little black book and he tells them this stuff. And of course, ah, here it is. It's here.
Interesting.
You're following it.
Where would that come from? Where would a mythology, including a book, come from? Because
Yeah, a book.
I mean, the history of writing and is and much less a codex book. That's
Yeah.
got to be a fairly. I mean, that's super super interesting.
Yeah, I would love that would be a good I'll have to talk to my friends that still work there to trace that back.
Yeah. I mean, I still have my conservative church upbringing whispering in my ear, God is the blessed controller of all things. And so, that maybe a vision or a dream given a long time ago in anticipation of this guy showing up just preaching in English. But I mean, that raises a lot of questions too. But that's super interesting. That's a very
Yeah.
captivating story.
Maybe they didn't have a book, just a black object of some kind
Yeah, yeah,
was bringing,
yeah, yeah,
so I don't know the background of that, but that would be fun to follow.
yeah, yeah.
Gosh. So anyway, fast forward a few years, and Trevor McElwain and his family were sent there to then follow up this great people movement that was happening,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
And he's an Australian, and so he goes in there, and I'm working with Christians, so he starts teaching them the introductory stuff to Christianity, right? And he's getting like I got always back at you, realizing, what, whoa, they're not catching any of this. What's going on here? And I wonder if they understand the gospel. So he starts backtracking, and he realized they don't even understand the gospel.
Uh-huh.
Now what do I do? And that was the big question.
Mm.
And out of that would be birthed the chronological Bible teaching that would start there in the Philippines and would eventually be changed, name, title, and so forth would change, but it would go global within the mission world
Mm.
and beyond that as well.
And that was just like, let's start with Genesis and tell the story through to Jesus. So
Yep.
the story tells, you find your place in the story, and so that the truth comes out as an experienced narrative, not as data argued. Is that
Right.
no?
It's the human experiences that capture us,
Mm.
right? And so that's what as you would go through the stories, those human experiences would capture those people again,
Mm.
hopefully bring them to Christ. And that's what he did.
Mm.
He would come up with his he tied evangelism, discipleship all together, and he came up with 7 different ways or 7 levels of doing that. But the first 4 levels were the ones that really caught on and went global. First phase would be from Genesis 1 through the ascension. And you show your lostness and then how Jesus would become your savior,
Mhm.
like that. Then he went back and he redid the same thing. Instead of looking at, he would retell those stories again, but to show that, like, the first time you go through and you talk about the flood and so forth and knowing what he did. Second time you went through, you were an unbeliever, you were actually outside the ark.
Ah.
You were drowning, so you were separated from God, but your faith would get you back into the boat. So he would do that contrast all the way through in the second phase.
Interesting.
Third phase, he would go into, the book of Acts, and so show the life of the new church and so forth and try to get that, um, established. And then the fourth phase would be epistles. And so within a short it wasn't short, but it was over a year, but you would have Genesis through Revelation, unlike most of us.
100%. Yeah, those it's short. That's pretty short. A year to get through that content. Yeah,
Like that.
yeah.
And then nobody picked up that, from 5, 6, and 7, basically nobody did that. But the first 4 phases were really very, very important, and very holistic in a sense because it gave and most people outside you once you get outside the Western world, I think hold apart rather than parts the whole,
Mhm.
if we to the whole.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
That was very instrumental, and then seeing that big picture and understanding that, and that fit right in with their pedagogy. So,
Cool. That was called the chronological
Bible teaching,
Bible teaching,
CBT, yeah.
and that spread everywhere. And it has a different kind of name now, but it's still used. Is it still kind of the foundational approach? Or
So what happened after that was, we decided as a New Tribes mission, because we realized, wow, this is kind of an answer we've been looking for and had no clue what to do with it. If only we would have been doing our research. People have been doing this for a long time, but didn't have an overall plan as significant as McElwain's plan. But there was a story approach that was kind of scattered in different parts of the world that was being used, and that's documented in the book on worldview-based storying that I have. Gives you that history of that. But so anyway, we as an agency, we decided we're going to move in this direction. And our field director was good friends with the IMB director in Manila. And Jim Slack, when he heard of this, he thought, wow, this is really good.
And IMB is the International Mission Board of the Southern Baptist, which is probably one of the biggest sending agencies in the world for missionaries, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It is the biggest. We were at 3,000 plus at that point. So we were like the second. This is very different today, but back in that day, we were kind of like the two biggest agencies that were there. And both directors knew each other and were good friends. And so they would talk, and they heard about McElwain and what he was doing, this story approach. And he said, wow, I want to get him in here to the Southern Baptist here. And so they invited him. He did some conferences for them, just as he did for us, New Tribes Mission, to get it within the whole agency. And they picked that up and they took it and ran with it. New Tribes was kind of like, it's good for us, and we got it and finally got the answer.
Right.
We don't need anything else, and just give it to the Southern Baptists. They can pick it up and they do it. And so they were the ones that helped spread it outside the agency of New Tribes Mission and get it to go global. The movement's global. I mean, there's no doubt about it. It went global.
Yeah, I mean, if you just Google the biblical orality movement,
Yeah.
you find information on it. It's a
Yeah.
I mean, would you say, is it now the standard practice for missionaries around the world to teach and share, like in storying?
Yeah. I would like to say it. I'm afraid I can't, because we've still got a lot of people who have not caught on to that.
Yeah.
But I mean, it is definitely significant. It definitely became a movement with all the different variations of how people presented it, and some just did it for evangelism, and some put it together for a whole church planning thing from beginning to end, right? Curriculum for the church and so forth, from a story perspective, from a character perspective. So it just depends on who you're talking to, but it's definitely became a global movement. Definitely.
So I mean, from that approach, I mean, you were baptized into it, into a conversation about storying, about oral communication, and I mean, it was all just very practical, right? Like this is the method that the majority world, this is how they're going to understand and receive the story of Jesus. Is that?
Yeah.
I mean, that's
That's exactly it, because
yeah.
back to my first approach, propositional approach, right?
Uh-huh.
It blew up in my face. Switching the story, all of a sudden, I go, oh my gosh, grandma's telling the story.
Mhm.
Kids are telling the story. How in the world did we miss this?
Yeah.
We missed this in our training program. And if anybody should have had it, it should be people working with tribal people.
Right. Sure.
But it missed it. And so that was, the beginning of a really change within the whole organization and how it would do its training and so forth. And McElwain would develop a whole system out of that. But basically, the first 4 phases were the only 4 that really hung on.
So it seems like
Then the Baptists pick it up, and boom, it went global after that.
yeah. It seems like the whole direction of the understanding of orality in this movement, the whole direction was out.
Yeah.
Like, it wasn't necessarily what is the Bible or how do we interpret the Bible or anything like that. It's like we already know that.
Yeah.
We want to communicate what we know to people who don't know Jesus. And so we're learning it was almost more sociological
Yeah.
than a biblical movement. Is that fair to say?
That's very fair to say, yeah. And that's exactly where we were. Okay. That's where we were. So it was like the training gave you this part, and we did it very propositionally. Reality over here worked through the story approach, and we found out, oh my gosh, okay, we didn't have the training we should have had. So we had to develop that training for all our personnel to switch them over.
Sure, sure, sure.
And that's what we did.
Mm.
And then it became part of the training program back in the States and Australia and wherever, England and so forth.
Yeah.
That became part of the overall training. But that was a total paradigm shift for us.
Mhm.
And we forgot that scripture is actually, a big story.
Right, right, right.
We've all studied it systematically, right? If propositionally,
Uh-huh.
that's where training came, and we walk into this context, and they look at it and say, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah.
As soon as you switch to story, it was like, "Yeah, oh gosh."
Well, I mean, that's our culture, right? I say it almost every podcast interview now is we're, of course, post Gutenberg, but we're also post Enlightenment, post rationalism, post industrial revolution, post scientific revolution. And so everything for us is we're categorizing,
Mhm.
systematizing, ordering. Everything is a proposition to be understood categorically. Postmodernism, I know, is a thing or was a thing. We're like postmodern now. I don't even know. But
Yeah.
modernism, this positivistic approach, it has so captivated our minds that even though we say we're post it, we're still categorizing. We're still categorizing. Well, trying to know that way is wrong, so now I'm gonna know this way. And so we're still working with intellectual concepts
Yeah.
instead of communal identities.
Yeah.
We're still learning what is true so that we can live out the truth. And maybe that truth is, it's my truth, but it's not like what is our identity together? What's
Yeah.
our story? Which is a very that's those are two very different approaches to epistemology, to understanding where we go in life. So, Tom, this movement was, like we said, all moving out. It was all, this is how we have our categories, we have our stuff, and so now we need to share it in a way that these cultures can receive. And so we're gonna tell the stories to help people receive Jesus. But and I'm sure there's more people in the biblical orality movement also who haven't, but you didn't stay just moving out. You actually turned your eyes to the Bible and started thinking, well, what does this mean for what the Bible is and how I read the Bible? Like, I need to start talking about doing uh, almost exegesis. I mean, your book, character theology it's still very practical. Here's how we can have these Bible studies, but there's also this part of like, we can understand the Bible differently if we approach it as stories focusing on characters, not just focusing on presupposition concepts or whatever. But what was the pivot? Did you even notice that pivot, or was it more natural for you? What was the pivot point for you to start approaching the Bible differently? Not just approaching teaching differently, but yeah.
Yeah. I think it goes back when I brought the comic books back in and started teaching it and saw their reaction to those stories and how they then just picked them up and started telling them all over the place. I started rethinking, okay, what are the basic genres of scripture?
Right.
You can't get the theology out of me, okay?
So,
So, okay. So you have, you've got narrative, okay, you got story, you've got poetry. If we just make 3 to make it easy, and you probably could boil them all down into that anyway. But, and then we got the propositional side of it, the epistles, okay, we got those 3. What percentage would each one I asked myself, what oh my gosh, narrative, I started to realize, was the predominant genre.
mm.
I focused on the smallest part of the genre, which was the propositional, which was the epistles.
Uh-huh.
It was only like 10%.
Mm.
And then you have the poetry is 30 some percent in there.
Mm.
That's the emotional side of it.
Mm.
It's the connection between orality and the emotional side of it,
Mm.
the poetry side. The story side of it. So now you're talking, if it's the majority of it, 50+% plus the poetry, now you're 80 some 5% or whatever, maybe more, that's connected to the orality, which gives you the emotion and the story component of it.
Mm.
Here, focused over here with the Ifugal
Right.
on the smallest 10%, and they're wondering, what is he talking about? You know,
Yeah.
they don't get it.
Yeah.
And so that's when I started seeing just how the Bible was broken down. And I asked myself, if I was God and I was making the Bible, okay, I could help out these Bible translators in a hurry. Give them 10 propositions, have them translate it. We got it. Here's the message.
Right.
Yeah. Well, we know how that would fly.
That's
But-
right.
So why did God use almost 90% of scripture probably from the story and the emotional side? And there's a little overlap between those, right? To help us understand, and even those propositions, where'd they come out of? They came out of that overall story.
Yeah.
So the connection between them. So there must be a meta narrative. See, I'm thinking all these things I'm trying to reflect back on, okay, could I give the meta narrative of scripture in a couple of sentences, 3 or 4 sentences, make a paragraph if you want to,
Mm.
that would capture that overall message?
Mm.
Then I'm thinking, I never tried that.
Right. Right.
I need to try that. I need to try to write it down and see what this message is, because that's what's driving all the other little stories, right?
Right.
That meta narrative behind that is parts of that meta narrative are in these stories.
Mm.
So these are things I were thinking, and I'm reflecting back on my training
Mm.
and thinking, I never got any of this.
Mm-hmm.
I never got any of this. Why didn't And then I started doing some research, right? And I started realizing, and I just looked in the mission world to begin with. And I remember when I was home one time, because I was going to Dallas Bible College, finishing off my undergrad, and I went over to Dallas Theological Seminary to meet with Dr. Pentecost, who was running the missions program there. And we had a discussion what I was doing and so forth. And he says, have you ever read Warnick's book on the living Christ and dying hedonism? No. I said, like, and he says, how about Weber's book on communicating the gospel to illiterates? No. Anyway, after our conversation, which was about 3 hours long, I went down to the library, pulled those dudes out there. Oh my gosh. And they're using story in here. These are from 1950s.
Mm.
Okay. How did we miss that in our training program?
Sure. Yeah.
And so I had to pick that up, and I started reading through that stuff and realizing, oh, there was a story approach. That's when I met Jacob Lohman, and he did practical anthropology.
Mm.
And in one of the articles that he wrote in there was presenting the gospel through characters in the Old and New Testament. Now, this is perfect. Okay? This is pre-McElwain. This is pre-chronological Bible teaching. And so, okay, I'm learning all this stuff, trying to put it together. And McElwain would give me a program. I had the characters. I knew that we need to go to character theology. I just didn't have a package of how I put it together for evangelism that would flow right into discipleship, not be evangelism and discipleship, but 2 chapters out of the same book. Evangelism flowed right out. Discipleship flowed right out of the evangelism. You just move from here to here, but you build on what you've got. And that would give you connect the meta narrative. See, I'm thinking all these things, and all this is kind of like revelation. And we look at it back today, and you think, "Gosh, it's so simple."
Well, no, it's hard. It's hard to break out of a paradigm. I mean, you don't you don't know you're thinking in a box when you're in the box. That's that's the universe you live in. And even still, I can imagine me listening to this conversation 10 years ago and saying, uh, all that matters is getting the information right.
Yeah, yeah.
Who cares about the story if the information is wrong? And as a matter of fact, I had an argument. Maybe it was the biggest argument I had with this friend of mine. Um, and the argument was he had just read a book, and he was talking about the importance of story. And I was this very, conservative. I'm a very linear thinker, and I was like, who cares how much the story impacts you if it's false? It can impact you to do something wrong. Like, all that matters is it true? We need to get the truth. And I think that I was maybe on the extreme end of the spectrum there, but I do think that resonates with most of us who come out of seminary, which is we've got to get the data right. We've got to get the gospel right. We don't need to be a heretic. We actually need to expose the wolves and those heretics around to protect the flock. And it's all about getting this data right. But who at the end of the day, and this is with this conversation with this argument with my friend, we were just going at it and mad at each other. I was at least mad at him. He was probably closer to Jesus than I was, but I I was I liked the guy, loved the guy too much to walk away angry. And sitting in that, eventually I finally got to the point where I realized, what's good is a truth if you don't have the context to actually internalize it and live it out. If you can't become something in line with the truth, then who cares if it's true or not? And it is, we tell ourselves stories more than we tell ourselves propositions. Like, I don't tell myself, hey, a good father does A, B, C, and D. What I tell myself is, I'm a bad father today. I screwed up this time. Or, I'm God's gift to the world, But we tell these ourselves, there's these stories, these plot lines that we accept and we live out more than the propositions. But these stories can provide, kind of weave together a basket that can hold the propositions as we internalize them. And so that was a big shift for me. And I I was right there, Tom. I was on that conversation with my friend. I think was a cusp moment that I was able to look outside of the box and see there's something else out there besides just getting it right. And then lately, over the past 10 years, God has been just revealing to me in scripture things like we all know in part and prophesy in part. If anybody thinks he knows anything he does not yet know as he ought to know. But if anybody loves, he's known by God. Knowledge puffs up, but love builds up. So there's a way to have all the right knowledge and be wrong
Yeah.
if you're not living the story. If you don't step into the flow of God's move in humanity and become a part of the community of God, then you do not know as you ought to know. And that's the gift I think that we can gain by going back to this oral traditional approach is they weren't telling stories just because the stories were true. Yes, they were true, but what mattered was this is who we are.
Yeah.
And it's so powerful and more alive
And so neglected.
and so neglected. We
Okay.
fight over propositions instead of living the yeah.
Easter Sunday.
Mm.
That's only been a few weeks back,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So I'm 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 always interested to see what's going to be what's going to be how that story's going to be told or not told. Anyway, it's Easter Sunday. This is a mega church, right? And the topic was four things an unbeliever could gain if from believers.
Mm.
Okay, thinking that's interesting. We did not hear anything about the story of the crucifixion and the resurrection. No story component, not one thing. We didn't get to hear how a centurion changed his mind and would believe in the end. We didn't hear how that thief on the cross who was mocking him first and then would change his mind and say, Today, but when we get to the paradise, will you take me with you? Yeah, today you will be with me in paradise. We didn't get to hear that. We didn't get to feel of Mary and Magdalene and the other people going back that Sabbath evening with no leader anymore
Mm.
and feel that pain and that separation.
Mm.
Now what do? We didn't get to feel any of that emotion. It was these practices. I asked my wife on the way home, what were the four things that we should know that we could gain from? He could not think of one of them. I could not think of one of them.
I know.
And so I asked, why would you assume on Easter morning, when you have a lot of people come to church who never come to church, that you would not tell the story? Why are you assuming that you don't need to tell the story? Do you assume they know the story? Do you assume that you can't learn anything new from a story?
Mhm.
And so I was going down in my mind, what's going on here? Is just the principles that are the thing that are count, like we talked before. It's objective truth, right?
Yeah.
I can remember McElwain talking about stories and objective truth,
Yeah.
you know, and because we never separated them.
Uh-huh.
There's objective truth in stories,
Right.
but there's also emotions in stories because it's holistic.
Right.
That's the orality aspect of it, right? It comes to us holistically, but we want to focus on just the objective truth here to keep it. That's what our training has been. So it was like, oh my gosh. Then when Mary goes back, right, and finds the tomb empty, we didn't get to feel her feelings of what'd they do with him? Where'd they take him? Now what's up? What do we do? And then
Mhm.
goes back and tells the disciples, right?
Yeah, yeah.
No, nobody listens, right?
Right.
The- there's, and then finally Peter and John goes running us, and we don't get to experience their confusion when they get there.
Mhm.
See, that's what makes that story impactful. If I just tell you the
Right.
objective truths about this story,
Right.
that's the missing component, and that's why Christianity is so deadening. Dead dog.
Mhm.
Um, why would you not tell me the story on Easter morning
Yeah.
4 times or whatever it was, 3 times in the morning, you know?
Yeah.
That was it. I just have a hard time with that because you realize he doesn't understand is that the power that is in story the power that words have in story, and the power that the interaction between characters had in making a impression upon you, that, what do you call it? The power of human experiences
Yeah.
what people went through during that short time from Friday to Sunday.
Yeah.
We didn't get to experience what they experienced, and therefore the impact was not there.
Yeah.
It wasn't there.
Yeah.
It was deadening.
Well, it's because, I am not a set of propositions. You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah.
my life,
Yeah.
so much of who I am, for better and for worse, is not because of a set of propositions, but because of the story of my life. And now I can learn that something is wrong or right and adjust the story. But and it does matter. Like, truth matters. Like Paul says, hey, if Jesus hadn't been resurrected, we'd all be the most pitiable people in the world. Like, he does say, if anybody preaches a different gospel, let them be accursed. I think there are parts of objectivity that matters. One of my favorite pastors used to always say, nobody's smart enough to be all wrong. You know, like, we got something right in modernism and in the West.
Yeah.
Like, truth is true. You can't escape it. Truth, like, truth is real and it matters. But it's not the biggest thing that matters. And you can't, here's a proposition. You can't escape propositions.
Yeah.
And you also can't live based just on propositions, especially in relationships. One of my favorite examples to talk about it, and this is, my wife and I are, um, we just celebrated 20 years of marriage this year, and she's the most amazing, most special person in my life, and we've had a hard go at it. Our personality traits are opposites, like in Myers-Briggs, like, we're opposite on every single category. We're both babies of the family, which birth order books say that's the hardest relationship to have as spouses. A few other things that just really works against us liking each other. And we do. We like each other a lot. We love each other. But we've had some really interesting interactions. And one of my favorite to talk about in this discussion is, one time we were having a pretty big fight. It was date night. So, of course, we're going to fight on date night and ruin date night. And so we go and we're arguing about something. And she ends up throwing a piece of bread at me. And the bread hits, and it's hard, but it's crispy bread. It hits me in the chest and it falls on my soup. And I pick it up and I dip it in the soup and I start eating the bread, and she says, "Aren't you going to respond to that?" And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, honey. I don't know how to respond to crazy." And I thought I had just chosen war. When I said that, I thought had stepped over a line and was like, here's the next week, I've just chosen war. Well, actually, instead, she just started laughing. She thought that was a funny thing that I said, and she said, "That was crazy. I'm sorry. I just threw a piece of bread at you." And we laughed, we heard each other, we apologized, and had a great date night.
Beautiful.
Now, propositionally,
Yeah.
that means the next time we're in a fight, all I have to do is say, "I don't know how to respond to crazy," and
Mhm.
everything will be better, right? Well, absolutely not. Because relationships don't operate just propositionally. There's emotions, there's pasts, there's anticipations for the future. There's all kinds of things going on in a relationship. There's just the chemical makeup in your body that day, depending on how much sleep you had or what you've eaten or not. Anyway, we don't live simply propositionally. We are embodied, storied people, and that's always been true. And I mean, I think it would be helpful if our modern Western propositional culture would realize the proposition that that's not the way that humanity works,
Yeah.
you know, and embody the story of humanity.
we were in Hong Kong and at the Baptist seminary there, and it was a big conference on orality. So during one of the breaks at lunchtime, a bunch of us were just walking around, just seeing what we could see. And one of the pastors, who happened to be an American, made this statement. This is an orality conference, okay?
Yeah.
Says, theology is too important to leave the story.
Yes. Yeah.
And
I would have said it.
whoa, I mean, yeah, pre ago, I would have said it too.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm thinking, have you been listening?
Yes.
I'd already given my talk, and so it's like, I didn't say, I didn't want to jump in this one. Okay, I just said, listen. And then I've come across things like that later on, where people would say, I prefer "Thus saith the Lord" than "Once upon a time."
Mm-hmm.
Or another one said, "Stories offer shallow theology."
Mm-hmm.
And that our training has taught us to think that way.
Yes.
And that's the objective side, and we're holistic people. That's
Yeah.
the problem.
Yeah.
We have if we don't come out as holistic people, we're not gonna get that full impact of that message from Scripture, which I wasn't getting,
Yeah. Sure.
because I was focused on the objective truth side of it.
Right.
Missed the impact that was already there,
Mm-hmm.
that I just didn't see.
Yeah.
The Ifugao caught it immediately through those stories.
Embodied it even, I bet. They didn't know, oh, we should love each other. I bet they actually started loving each other better.
It just practice flows out of it,
Yeah.
you know?
And so I'm convinced. I'm convinced of this because I'm convinced that we say things like that. I prefer "Thus saith the Lord" than "Once upon a time," because we feel more in control
Yeah.
when we have propositions, black and white. "Thus saith the Lord." I can gather those together, categorize them, systematize them, and then I never have to step out in faith in behavior or activity or thought ever again.
Yeah.
But God hasn't called us to be new Pharisees with a new code to submit to, but to be free sons now living in the Holy Spirit, to walk as participants in the story.
There.
And we lose a level of control, but we gain a part of what God created us for, which is to be co-heirs to the throne of Christ, co-regents on creation. And it is a little more scary. It is less packaged. It is more messy. It's also true.
I used to say that too, it's more messy. And somebody came back to me and corrected me and said, "Messy for whom?" Oh, it wasn't messy for the audience. It's messy for us Westerners who are in these boxes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because we don't have that control
Yeah.
that we're there. And that's why our theology is looked for correctness.
Mhm.
Story looks for coreness.
Hmm.
What's the coreness out of this that we should get?
Mhm.
Which leaves a little, that's what I call boundaried fluidity.
Mhm.
So it's messy from our perspective,
Right,
right?
right, right,
From the oralist perspective, it's not messy, it's just normal.
right.
Gray, black and white is not abnormal.
Yeah.
From their perspective, it's much more gray, right? We have a hard time because, like you say, we lose control once you move into that messiness. We lose that control, but its coreness it's the key there, which allows that little bit of fluidity
Right.
that we're not used to and don't like, and it's hard to put in books.
Right. Yeah.
In our theology sections, right? It's hard to put it in there, but it's like those are some of the things we have to broaden our understanding out, and that's where story is so holistic,
Yeah.
right? And because we're propositional, we're so one-sided.
Yeah.
It's this, that. It's actually could be kind of a meshing of those two,
Totally.
and that's what story does.
Yeah.
It mixes them. So the emotions, objective and subjective truth have to come together
Yeah.
because that's who.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And it's hard. Like I struggle with this stuff. I think about a great insight into this conversation is Robert Alter's
Mm,
the art of biblical narrative, and he talks about type scenes, which I didn't realize it on my first reading of that section in his book, that he says that he actually got this concept from studying orality scholars like Lord and Perry, and I don't know if he mentioned Foley or not, but at any rate, he talks about the fact that in the Bible, so many people meet their wives at a well.
yeah,
Moses
yeah.
meets his wife at a well. Um, uh, Isaac is Abraham sends a servant and meets Isaac's wife at a well, right? Jacob meets his wife at a well. Um, Saul um, meets women at a well, but doesn't get married. And Alter says, these are like type scenes, kind of like a Western movie. You're watching a Western, you're hoping for and waiting for that scene when we get to this dusty road. There's a church off in the background, and the good guy steps in front of the church. The bad guy's on the other side. Tumbleweed blows across. There's some emotional music in the background. Cuts to their eyes, cuts to their hands with their guns on their hip, and then boom, and the good guy wins. We all know it's coming. We all know exactly what's going to happen. We're disappointed if it doesn't happen. But if something changes, if when you get the routine or the pattern, if the pattern changes, that's usually telling us something about
Yeah.
the story, about what we're supposed to take away, about the character, right? And so when Saul meets these girls at a well, but nobody draws water, there's no betrothal, there's no meal. Well, this is an aborted betrothal scene.
Yeah.
Is it a coincidence that that happens with the aborted king? Um, um, and so now, is it a coincidence that Isaac, who hardly shows up in the Bible in any meaningful way, is actually not even present at his betrothal scene? He's the passive guy, while Rebecca and Jacob are conspiring to get the birth right or whatever. Like, he's passive, and he's passive in his own betrothal scene. Jacob the wrestler wrestles the stone and takes control of the situation at his scene. Moses the deliverer saves the women at the well. Like, is all this coincidence? And then the propositional mind, what I struggle with is, man, did all of that actually happen just right to tell the story the same way, but just different enough that applies specifically to these different stories? And if those well scenes didn't actually happen, but they told them like they happened, does that mean the Bible's not true? And what part of the Bible is not true? What part of the Bible is true? Where are my propositions? And it feels scary, like maybe I'm losing some control over
Mhm.
but this is me coming to this product of an ancient oral traditional culture, and I'm asking questions of the text that they would have never thought about in the first place. And the fact of the matter is, those stories are true. And I do believe that God is sovereign enough that maybe he made all those happen exactly the way that we read them. But I don't have to have those answers to know that this story is true about who the Israelite people were and their identity, which is who the Messiah was. what the Messiah taught and did was in line with this tradition, and that he actually did die, he actually did raise from the dead. We know that's historically true because of the way the New Testament presents it all. And I know that the story that is told is true, and that's my story, and I'm gonna live it out. But all that to say, the whole ramble was just to say, I still struggle with the idea that the Bible is not what it would have been if I would have written it from my culture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In my 10 propositions.
And my 10 probably 100%. Yeah. Yeah, I'd have everybody in the right uniform and walking the right way and talking the right way.
That's why you and I are not God.
That's right. And the whole world celebrates it.
Yeah. Gosh, it's like,
Yeah. Yeah, yeah.
yeah, and that goes back to, I mean, the world began in orality, right? So we really,
Yeah.
when you think about what was the first thing God wrote, it was, we don't get it in the garden.
Mhm. Right.
So we got the 10 Commandments. So, they were spoken before they were written.
Yes, right.
And finally we get them.
Right.
And so, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. We are the science hyphen enlightenment era has left its mark on us in our theology so strong that, to move toward the story aspect of it, narrative theology of it. I mean, I know the critiques that would come when you mention this in certain places. That's too ambiguous.
Yeah.
You can't do that.
Right.
And it's too subjective.
Right.
But see, again, we've separated them on this side and on that side, and the two are not supposed to blend, but they do blend because we blend. And
Oh, yeah. Well, so I'm getting ready. I'm gonna teach a class on the book of Romans in a few
there
in
you
a
go.
few weeks.
Yeah.
And goodness gracious. Um I love how this one of the textbooks I'm gonna use, the guy starts off and says, let's look at is it Second Peter 3:16, I think, where the author of Second Peter, let's just call him Peter, says the stuff that Paul wrote is really hard to understand. Now that's somebody, an author of scripture
Yeah.
from Paul's day saying there's a lot of stuff in his letters that are hard to understand. Now, I'm supposed to teach the book of Romans in such a way that I'm supposed to say, here's what the book of Romans is, here's what it says, here's what it means, here's how we apply it, and here's how you teach it now when you go off and leave seminary and step into your ministry. How am I supposed to do that when the author of Second Peter says, "Hey, there's stuff in there that's just hard to understand," and people take what's hard to understand and twist it toward destruction?
Yeah.
Like I'm afraid that we have prized and worshipped absolute objective truth so much that we've turned it into an idol, and we've twisted these things that are actually hard to understand perfectly into propositions that we think we understand perfectly to our own destruction and the destructions of those. And so now we fight over predestination and free will, and we fight over women in ministry, and we fight over all these hot button topics because we've turned the Bible into these things we have to know for sure. And if people don't know it and know it for sure the way that we do, they're anathema.
Yeah.
And it's
Exactly.
and I think that Jesus Christ weeps.
Yeah.
The gates of Hades won't stand against my church. Um, and he prays, Father, let them all be one, just as you and I are one. But we're going to fight over these propositions that Second Peter says are hard to understand.
You got to remember, though, Peter was just a fisherman. Okay. Well, he can't handle this sophistication up here that we work with and live in.
Yeah.
So that's the problem. When he gets an education, then he'll be able to handle what we handle.
Yeah.
and come to the same conclusions as well.
Yeah, Jesus would never trust a guy like Peter, right?
That's the problem, though. What did he chose a fisherman?
Yeah.
You know, one of the questions that I have is, um, can we take even the stories? Can we make those stories come across, bringing out the lives of those characters such a way that the non-specialist can actually grasp this and go away with something and actually transform a person's life? Wow, that's instead of being mesmerized by all these nice little categories and how this one fits into this one.
Right.
And I remember asking a theologian one time, never ask theologians questions.
So yeah.
Do you think that we could come up with, like, do you think we could come up with a theology that's not in systematic theology already? By people from different parts of the world looking at that same story that you and I have looked at, but for how many years, but somebody will come in that and ask a question or see something in there that we don't even see. And if they do, what do you do with that? And he said, oh, well, you have all these categories, whatever that would be, we would fit it in underneath one of these existing categories. That's the control.
Yeah.
And what that says is you can actually control God. That we have it, right?
Yeah.
We finally got
Or even if it's not we can control God, it's that we can fully understand God.
there. That's what I meant to say.
You said,
That was a better way of saying it.
either way, it's kind of like being back in the garden again.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
That's where it is. It's like, um, switching just a little bit. I want to look at those three categories because that helped me to blend, to bring this stuff together. And rather than seeing it in just where I started in the missionary movement of the orality, again, bringing it back.
Yeah.
That was, and then the biblical world, where we get into narrative criticism, biblical criticism, etc. And then the secular world and how those three, the secular, the religious world, and then the mission world, and how those three started coming together. And I mean, I was so ignorant of this stuff back in the day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the Ifugao course got me thinking about it. McElwain comes on the scene and offers chronological Bible storying, or excuse me, Bible teaching. And I start to see how we could put evangelism and discipleship all together into one book with multiple chapters. Then I saw how Jim Slack of the IBM, International Mission, IBM, what is it?
Board.
Mission.
Mission Board. International Mission Board.
There you go, Mission Board. Yeah. And J.O. Terry, he's now 80s, down in Fort Worth, still putting stuff out. You can get on his list, okay? You'll receive periodical publications. The guy's still thinking sharp as a needle.
That's awesome.
Yeah. And what's interesting with J.O. Terry is that he comes from a radio background. So he knew you had to connect your message with the audience. And he would come up with some generic things of how you would handle Buddhists, how you would handle Muslims. They're very generic. New Tribes was very detailed in how they would do each one of those. But he would have generic things to help you think how you would tell this story for a Muslim, for a Buddhist, for whatever. So he brought that concept in there. And he's the one who took chronological Bible teaching and he said, you got too much teaching in here. That he changed it to chronological Bible story. And even though McElwain talked about storing, it was always that objective truth. The propositions were always right there.
Sure.
He was too tied to the old system, right? Where J.O. Terry can come in as a radio background and say, oh, let's push it more to the story side of it, chronological Bible story. And then he would say, why do you need chronological? That's a Western concept,
Mm.
beginning to end,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And I would call it now, he just dropped chronological. Just call it Bible story.
Mm.
But then you lose some stuff out of that when that happens. I would call it episodic story, Bible story, episodic, because it's the Bible comes to us episodically, not just in chronological order.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's more, I think, faithful to Scripture how it's laid out. If you think of it in episodes rather than in chronological, because it's not chronological. So but he helped us start to think through those categories and how we would do that. And so now there's a variety of, now you almost have systematic chronological theology. It's hard to get away from that, so it's like, it's, you have some of that out there.
Yeah.
But anyway, that background in my visit with, I should say too, still with the Baptist side of it, Southern Baptist side of it, Avery Willis, are you familiar with him?
No, I'm not.
He used to head up for the Southern Baptist, then the discipleship side of it, on the U.S. side of it.
Okay.
He would hear from J.O. Terry and Jim Slack and others about this story thing approach, right? And he started to listen to that, and he's like, we can bring that into discipleship here in the U.S. And so he was responsible for helping it get into the U.S. side of it in the Southern Baptist.
You.
So him and Grant Lovejoy, he taught him homiletics, and he's, wow, we could change whole homiletics by yeah, format and looking at the Bible as a meta narrative, and he went off into all that stuff. Now he heads up the whatever it is for the Southern Baptists in that area.
Mm.
And I just had an email from Daniel Sanchez yesterday, taught at Southwestern, and him and J.O. Terry didn't have a degree, so Sanchez would provide the professor of record. And J.O. would go off into all these teachings of this stuff, and they did it for 10 years. Co-authored a number of books in this whole area. So that's how it got into the Southern Baptist, and then from that, of course, it spread all over.
Mm-hmm.
But what I started finding out as I started branching out, that, oh my gosh, I learned from Jim Slack that he had studied in seminary.
Okay.
Okay. So I get this book, Orality and Literacy. I read, oh my gosh, look at this.
Yeah.
And from Ong, then I started going, okay, what's behind? Oh, he talks about Perry and Lord and all these Havelock and these guys, and I was, oh, so that got me into that whole secular world.
Yeah.
Fully Goody. I had learned about Goody in my grad studies from Sherwin-Williams. No, man, this is what we've been talking about.
Yeah.
And Goody will compensate for some of the separation of the great divide.
Yeah. Yeah.
That this and literacy is this. No, Goody would say no. These are actually integrated. And I learned about Ruth Finnegan, and her works. I learned about Havelock. I didn't like reading Havelock. A little philosophical for me. But then I got into Lord and Perry, and I thought, oh my gosh, look at this stuff. And then it actually goes back to Jase, or however you pronounce his name, that he wrote that book in 25. What is it called? Oral Style or something like that. He figures he's the father of this whole thing.
Oh, I didn't actually pick up on his name, actually.
Yeah. It goes back. Yeah, he claims he's the father of this, okay? In his book, look up Oral Styles, and you'll find that was his book in 25.
Moral styles.
So you got Perry's in the 30s, Havelock in the 60s, Finnegan and Goody, Foley in the 70s, and Ong in the 80s. And I'm seeing all this stuff, and I'm thinking, okay, well, that's enlightening.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like these guys have been dealing with this stuff and never got any of this in my training.
Yeah.
Never.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's totally absent. And I thought, okay, what's happened in the theological world? All right. And so I started looking, but before I get into it, I met Ram, okay, in his book on Christian view of science and scripture, 54 or something like that he wrote that book. And in that book, because he's focusing on hermeneutics, excuse me, he's focusing on hermeneutics, right? And so he has 2 axioms he follows in there. And those axioms would then penetrate theological training for decades. And there's still ramifications of it today. The first one was that training in logic and science is excellent for biblical exegesis. Okay? So if you don't have that background, there's going to be holes in your exegesis. And then his second axiom was that the systematic teaching of Scripture is systematic teaching of Scripture is its final intention.
Wow.
So it's yeah. And when you go back and look at the definitions of what is theology back in that day with Hodge and Schaeffer and all those guys, almost every one of those definitions has the word science in it somewhere.
Wow.
Yeah. And so that was where our training came out of, right?
Yeah.
And then when he hit the 60s, Richard Niebuhr's book on the meaning of revelation, I think it was, 60s, I forget what year, but 60 here when that came out. And in that, he argues that narrative is irreplaceable and untranslatable. And by untranslatable, he means that propositions are distinct from story, and we need to bring it actually back into story. And I'm thinking, whoa, that's in the 60s, okay?
Yeah.
And then you have Garrison in 61 comes out in his book on memory and manuscripts.
Okay.
And he makes us think about how oral tradition was part of the memory, had to be part of the memory. And the memorization part of it, and he brings us to start thinking about that. And then, actually, the first guy I ran into was Frey in the Eclipse of Biblical Narrative back in the 70s, 74 or something like that. And these are Yale guys, a couple of them are starting to see that, wow, narrative theology is really where it's at, and we have blown it. And we got to get back to narrative theology. That's why I call it the Eclipse of Biblical Narrative. And then I would eventually meet Kelber in 83. He really messed me up.
Yeah, I bet.
It's like, okay.
Wait, in 83, that's the movement has begun, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
He will be responsible for making us think of how theology is incorporated in this whole thing of narrative and getting us out of just thinking of propositions. And his book on oral and written gospel, will be and actually it was 25 years later, somebody, I forget who it was, looked back on that with a group of them, wrote a book on it, looking back 25 years and what has happened on that. Thatcher, I think, was the guy who did that. And so now we brought it into all this propositional world and it's challenging this approach. And I had no background in any of this.
Right. Oh, sure.
I would have to learn this all on my own, right?
Yeah.
And connect this with the secular side of it. So now we have the kind of the Christian worldview of this stuff and how it was all coming into shape and so forth, and how these would start to interact together. And now we have today, I think we have done a much better job of bringing these together to show the impact that one has had on the other and recorrection as well, to see that, oh, we went too far there, we didn't go far enough here, that type of thing. So
Yeah,
anyway, that
the conversation is definitely like starting now. It's going, but I mean, my struggles in my studies. I started Bible college in the fall of '98, and I crammed 4 years of college into 5, and then started my um, MDiv in 2005, and crammed 3 years of seminary into 7. And then, but I'm in seminary for this whole time. I took like 3 years off, and then started my doctoral work that I just finished in 2022. So I've been in theological education for the past 27 years,
wow. Wow.
and not one time in any seminary class did I hear anything on orality or oral tradition, except in my except talking about Gunkel or Bultmann or Mollwinkel or the Scandinavian school in passing, because it seems like nobody really knows exactly what the Scandinavian school really said, because nobody knows the language. There's only a few things that have been translated into English. Um, but anyway, yeah, the conversation is going now.
Yeah.
But when I was diving into this stuff, I mean, I came in to my doctoral studies, and I told people I'm going to do this. I am going to be obnoxious with two things. I'm going to be obnoxious with this oral traditional approach, because, I'm going to be obnoxious because I want to be loud enough to be silenced. Because if this is not as true and as powerful as I think it is, like I want to be silenced. But I'm going to make enough noise that people have to hear me and silence me if they can, you know? And nobody could, because nobody knew the conversation,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
Tremper Longman, actually in an email told me, he said, "I remember when, Perry and Lord, when their stuff really came out and started making waves in academia, and some of us started looking at this as far as the Hebrew Bible goes. But since Hebrew poetry is not metered and not formulaic in the ways that they were finding, that most of us didn't think that it applied to the biblical text like it did to Homer."
Yeah.
And and that seems, when looking at the scholarship, outside of people like Niditch and a few others, it really seems like, and that's why I'm doing this podcast, is because when I was wanting to find accessible information on like YouTube,
Yeah.
there's nothing.
Right.
I mean, even looking up Nidus, looking up Person, looking up David Carr. David Carr now is doing a few more podcasts, so it's kind of, you can find some of his stuff, but it was just impossible to find the conversation. And so, I mean, the conversation is happening, but it needs to be more well known,
Yeah.
you know. And then that's one of the things I really, really, really appreciate about you is that you've really engaged this conversation, but also like, um, one of the things that we talked about, maybe talking about, is this gap in the conversation for what does this conversation mean about how the average pastor, Sunday school teacher, small group leader, or just person in the pews who likes studying the Bible, what does this actually mean for how we interpret the Bible?
Mhm.
And that's been kind of a passion that we've both shared. That's kind of, for me, it's the path that matters most to me. And that's so, you have a book out, called Character Theology. And I mean, would you mind just breaking down like what what is character theology? How do you do it? Because it's a very it's a way to really to study the Bible based on the storied experiences of people in the Bible, right?
Right. Yeah, it's how do you sum it up? Yeah.
It's on Amazon. Just read it, right?
Yeah, just get your copy at Amazon. Um, because I came from a propositional approach, I started realizing that that's too esoteric for most people, right?
Mm.
And and I worked with a tribal setting, so I realized I had to move to characters, I had to move to stories. Well, I moved to stories first, and then I started realizing, wow, it's really actually the characters that are driving the story, right? And so anyway, I break that down in the book to show the strong focus on characters and the need to communicate all these abstract concepts, justification by faith, and all those type of things. How do I do that to these Ifugal people, right? I
Yeah.
cannot be talking about these abstract concepts. I have to get it into character form, into story format, that they could grasp it and walk away with it.
Right.
So that's uh, that I, coming out of the very systematic theology background, that was a major paradigm shift to how to do that. And so, as I said, when I started changing with the Ifugal, from my propositional approach, and I used actually comic books to do that to start and just tell the story and point to the pictures and tell the story. And I started realizing how wow, they get this. And not only get it, but they're telling other people, okay, now we're communicating. Now there's a possibility of a Christian movement within this group.
Yeah.
And so I would keep digging deeper and deeper into this because that was my job, number one, after I moved out of um, and start studying these people and learn how to do this. And what did they offer that will help us to grasp these concepts and get it into concrete means of doing it. And as I'm looking at the character theology, that's the title of the book, right? So how do we have characters teach this theology in a very concrete way that's very multipliable? Number one, comprehensible, but also then multipliable. Because I realized we're not having, there's no movement going to happen here unless they can take this
Mhm.
and tell stories and do that on their own.
Right,
It's
right.
not going to be up to me.
Right.
I have to get it started, but they have to be able to continue it.
Mhm.
Systematic theology is not going to do it. Okay.
Right, right.
Character theology, on the other hand, they pick up those stories immediately. They identify or don't identify with, or don't want to identify with certain areas.
All right.
So now there's the connection between the characters in the story and their own life. Oh, okay. Now we're getting somewhere. And so I also would learn from Trevor McElwain, that, well, let's start at Genesis and work our way through. Interestingly, Ifugal history starts with the flood. They have no create story.
Interesting.
They don't know where they came from.
Hmm.
They have no idea where they came from. Well, this is perfect.
Yeah, but they have a flood story, huh? That's interesting.
Yeah, that's the beginning of their history, the flood story.
Huh.
And there's a mountain right across from us. You can see it. It's only like 4,000 feet high, but there's a major mountain on the way to Baguio. It's 7,000 feet. One of the Ifugao ended up, a male on one end, and the female ended up on the other one. And they got together, and that restarted the Ifugao race.
Wow. Wow.
But they have no clue, you know, how they got here.
Hmm.
You want to know? And genealogies, of course, are very important.
Sure.
And so let me give you some genealogies of.
Yeah, yeah.
And we worked our way back to creation and the creation story, which was they didn't have, right? And they start seeing that, oh my gosh, look at this. And so we were able to connect from creation to the flood, the stories that they didn't have. And then, and from that show too, the sacrificial system, because their whole thing is based on the sacrificial system. Health, wealth, and long life drives their sacrificial system. So, but we showed them how it got corrupted the sacrifices got corrupted and went in these directions when actually those sacrifices were used back in the day to cover sin.
Interesting.
And stuff like
Yeah.
that. They can make those connections then, and we worked our way through the Old Testament and so forth. So, but I started, just bringing, how do you get those Bible stories then connected to their stories in a very concrete manner, using the sacrificial system and contrasting their sacrificial system with the sacrifice of Christ and how that differed. And so we had to work our way through all that.
Yeah.
But they could grasp it, they understood it, they got it,
Mm.
and they started telling it.
Yeah.
And our job was to work ourselves out of a job, and they've carried on. And that whole tribe is Christianized, with the message.
Mm-hmm.
And a good percentage of them are Christians, and they're connected with 6 other groups of Ifugao. They have their own association of churches now. We didn't work in the other ones. They're all different dialects. Other people worked in them, but they're interconnected now through association of churches. They're on their own. They do everything on their own. That was our goal. Exit strategy, work ourselves out. Let them take it over, run with it, Ifugao-ize it so that it's really Ifugao. I tried to do that. Was able to do certain things with it, especially the sacrificial system and stuff like that. We could help show the connections and where there's differences and what those differences were. So, yeah, it was fun.
No, and
It was fun to see and to see the results too.
yeah.
Looking back on it,
Yeah.
that's fun.
That's awesome.
Got back there a few years back and for one of their celebrations. That was really, really fun to see that.
You were there
But
just recently, weren't you? Weren't you out there like at one point whenever I was emailing you, or was that somewhere else you were?
yeah, I've been in in Manila the last few years. I do a class on oral hermeneutics.
Yeah.
Okay, listen to this. I don't know. I don't know if I told you this. There's was it Asian Theological Seminary has a distinct part of the school, and I can't remember the name of it, but it's under Asian Theological Seminary, and a group who have been involved in the Orality Movement started teaching orality as its own discipline, and all the way into doing the dissertations, right? So it's grad level.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
And inviting people in from all over Asia to do that. So the last 2 years, I've been going and teaching oral hermeneutics there, and it's as one of the classes.
Yeah.
And that is so fun.
Yeah.
Because you've got these people coming out of these our backgrounds,
Sure.
because we put our stamp on the schools.
100%.
Yeah, yeah. And this is bringing that oral side to it, oral tradition, oral background, into making us rethink that whole thing of education from that perspective.
Yeah.
And so they're just starting dissertations at this point now. And it's fun to listen to them and read what what they've come up with, right?
Mm-hmm.
And anyway, I could tell you all kinds of stories about that. But
Well, I love that so much, Don. You know, my connection to a lot of my motivation in a lot of this is missiological. My wife is carrying on some work in Togo that
okay,
my father-in-law started. They have a ministry that's called Le Pont, which is French for the bridge. And the dream is to build a bridge. Really, their website is called abridge2africa.org, but the vision is really to build a bridge from Africa to the rest of the world, because Pew Research says that by 2060, I think it's 4 out of every 10 Christians in the world will live in sub-Saharan Africa.
And so sub-Saharan Africa is poised to be the center of Christendom for the world. And I believe that can be so powerful. And but one of the desires I have is to protect the African church from being too westernized,
Yeah.
because the world needs an African gospel that is full of story and faith and power, not just the propositions to fight over.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I have a desire at some point to find some way, if I can, to have some kind of influence on the seminaries and the theological education there in Africa, to get this stuff rooted at a foundational level of, let's do our theological education in light of the oral traditional realities of
That.
the Bible's origins and of human nature itself, you know? So, yeah, that's wonderful. It's any place where this stuff is being taught as conceptual and methodological,
Yeah.
I think is so important.
Yeah. And I liked wedding the two, because if you start with characters, that's where they are, right? But they're not afraid to talk about concepts either.
Mhm.
But it has to be wedded back to characters.
Yeah.
That you can't break that connection or they'll lose it.
Yeah.
And so it's really almost like circular.
Mm.
You have the character, then you have kind of an abstract concept, but you bring it back to the character again. So it's circular in that way. And if you can do that, so it's not jettisoning the one or the other,
Sure.
but it for the narrative section of scripture, which is the predominant genre for scripture, then we need to have a connection to how do we use the characters to teach that theology, rather than start with the theology and maybe illustrate it with a character.
Right.
We've got to shift that for most of the world.
Mm-hmm.
If we can do that, then we're going to be communicating. But if we keep going the other direction from the abstract concepts of all these theologies in nicely linear form,
Right.
you're missing most of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because that latter approach that you talked about, it inevitably ends up with, I've got my list, I've got my system, I have my flow, and you have yours.
Yeah.
Which is then we're going to argue about it. So we have denominational splits, we have church splits, we can't work together. We were just asked to leave our denomination because of a peripheral issue like this, and as opposed to, let's find ourselves in the story and then let's live the story together. And you can do that even with knowing, oh yeah, I'm going to know in part and prophesy in part. You're going to know in part and prophesy in part. But let's move in the story together, because so much of the story is pretty simple. Like, we're created by a God of love, for love, love God, love others. And it's the power of the Holy Spirit that raised Jesus Christ from the dead that now connects us to the love of the Father, that we can live that out together in all the mess of figuring it out together. And, it's that sounds overly simplistic, but dadgummit, that's the gospel.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. It's too simple. Yeah.
We want to make it more complicated.
Maybe that was intended, huh?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah, because you can remember characters, right? From stories, you remember the characters, what they did, said, whatever, war or whatever. They make an imprint on your mind, and therefore you remember them. You carry them with you wherever you go.
Yeah.
And one of the things characters have never lost their centrality or their credibility in the Bible interpretation,
Sure.
but we haven't necessarily invited them to include them in this, right? And so that's what we have to bring them back and look at the character. That's who you walk away with, the characters in the story.
Well, this just hit me. Right? This just hit me is, the Bible itself teaches as a proposition that character is the most important thing to follow. Because it says, if you want to know who God is, God has been articulated, right? John chapter 1 says that who has articulated, and the word there is like articulated, explained, has if you want to know what has articulated the unseen God, it's not a list of propositions. It's not the law. It's the person, Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
If you want to know, and there's another place too that's escaping me now that says that it is Jesus who has best represented God. I know there's Colossians chapter 1, right? The fullness of God dwells in him, or actually all fullness dwells in him. But like the New Testament over and again says, if you want to know who God is, not here's these lists of characteristics of him or this list of propositions about him. It's look at the person of Jesus. Look at the character of Jesus in the story. And I really think, see him on the cross. But if you want to know God and what all your life is about, look at this character.
Yeah.
And every other character in their own way points to Jesus. So
Yeah.
You may have said that in your book, but that just occurred to me. It's kind of a big deal.
Oh, that's good. Put that in their appendix.
Yeah.
I'll put that into some revision.
Yeah.
Phyllis Stickley, if that's how you pronounce her name, I don't know, but in her book on the Great Emergence, just a small book, but she says every 500 years, Christianity has kind of a rummage sale.
Mm.
And you go up into the attic and you bring down all these theologies and you go through them and you see how many's relevant, and you have all these new ones coming in and you see if they fit in there. That's why she calls it a rummage sale.
Interesting.
You get rid of but I think part of the rummage sale that we have today is that we're bringing story and characters back into the equation out of that abstractness. And that is very relevant for today's audience when you think about it.
Yeah.
Social world, social media world, how the focus is on people, on relationships. And that brings us out of the abstractness of doctrines and that type of stuff.
Right.
So we have to go where the people are, and that's where the people are today. That's why character theology, I think, is so important. Looking at how people interacted back in the day, because it's relevant for today, and we see ourselves in those characters, and therefore they capture us, and we then either resist them or we say, wow, I need to move that one direction. So we have to react one way or the other with these characters, what we're going to do, how we're going to live.
Right.
And so character theology, I think, that's what addresses where we are today. Very concrete, very personable, but yet it's very collective as well, which into the different populations, because it's going to address the senses, it's going to address concreteness, the holism, all that type of thing. It brings that all together in our concrete lives, or our holistic lives.
Mm-hmm.
That stuff is brought together. And so even the community side of it. Now, community today is different than community back then, but community is community.
Yeah.
So we have to look, how does community define today? And that starts to give us clues of how we can approach this whole thing through characters.
Mm.
How does those two interact together?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a big field, but
It is.
characters, I think, that's where it's going to go.
Mm.
I think I said it this way somewhere, if I can remember it. Characters never lost their centrality or the curiosity or their credibility in Bible interpretation and theology. They just lost their invitation and inclusion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've got to get back and start to include them.
Yeah. Yeah. Our propositions have been doorkeepers, keeping them out. We need to open the doors and let the characters in.
So it's not jettisoning the propositions, but it's the entry point needs to be the characters, and let the characters take us to propositions, but make sure we get back to the characters.
Yeah. Man, Tom, it's such a vital conversation, and I love the way you're engaging. Is there anything else? It's about time here for us to wrap up. Is there anything else that you don't want to leave unsaid before we highlight a few of your works that people might be able to check out?
I just say that the lifeblood of orality is story, and the lifeblood of story is characters. But story's kind of abstract, right? We have to have the characters to make them concrete. And then the lifeblood of characters then is relationships. And that relationships takes us back to the Trinity. And those are all, tied together. If we can see that and keep the lifeblood of morality as the central part of our teaching, that gets us character, that gets us characters, that gets us relationships, that gets us back to the Trinity, very oriented. And that's where most of the population is today.
Yeah.
So they're not in the abstract concepts, okay?
Right. Well, it gets
Where you and I grew up going.
yeah. Well, it gets us back to the big two, right? I mean, love God and
Yeah.
love people. All of the law and prophets is summarized in this. Like all the propositions, everything else is summarized in these relationships. Yeah, that's so good. Well, Tom, tell us about your works. I did not know about the book that you wrote on exit strategies for missionaries.
Oh, yeah.
Um,
Oh, heaven.
do you remember what that?
Yeah, passing the baton. We were taught the three selves: self-government, self-propagating, self-whatever, and and that was supposed to be our strategies of our work. When I got to the Philippines after 16 plus years, nobody had turned their works over to the locals. Everybody still was missionaries in those tribal settings. And it was like they didn't know enough, so we have to give them more and more. So,
Right,
okay,
right.
got this, but they still don't know this. So and
Sure.
that's where I came in and said, "Yeah, that's where we got to stop this. This is ridiculous." Okay, work yourself out of a job. That was part of the training in the program. The three cells, work yourself out of a job, let them take over and do this. But it wasn't. But work modeled that for the rest of the field. And so it wasn't just a pull out, we phased out, and so we lived at our flight base so I could get back in, and we had people out, and we did a lot of curriculum development stuff together with them. So it wasn't like a cutoff period. No, there's constantly interaction. What's the issues? How do we handle them? Who's doing what? That type of thing. We carried that on. And so that was the book,
Passing the baton. So,
yeah,
and
that's what that was covered in there.
if you had one book that you wanted people to read, as far as what you have written for orality, what would that be?
Um, a simple one to start with, a basic one would be cross-cultural storytelling at home and abroad. That's a basic one, but it's complete, pretty complete. But well, second one would be worldview-based storying, the integration of symbol, story, and ritual in the orality movement. I'll get up there. That would be another one. The big one. Right?
The return of oral hermeneutics.
The return of oral hermeneutics. Okay. Which says what? It must have been here before. And it must have got lost somewhere. And we're bringing it back.
Wow. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's what it's all about in that one. Those would be kind of like the three biggies that I have here.
Awesome.
There's one other one that we did from the this one here on the new and old horizons in the orality movement.
Okay.
We at the one of the conferences that we put out a book on each one of every time there's a conference. Every year it's an annual book that comes out on morality. It's part of a conference that goes down. And so I don't know, there's like 4 or 5 books on it. That was the first one. And it shows how the orality movement has spread and the nuances of it, because, started in the Philippines with New Tribes Mission, Southern Baptists pick it up, and then it went all over the place. Okay. And now it's a global movement and nobody controls it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's where you want it.
Yeah, sure. That's right. That's right.
So that book there covers a lot of that, and looking at it and how and using orality in all different modes, not just in evangelism and in discipleship, but even in counseling and that type of thing. How do you use that in there? And so there's articles on that as well. So it's broad now.
Yeah.
In business mission, how do you use it in business's mission? All those different fields that you teach in, orality's got to be part of it, especially when you're working in certain parts of the world. But it's still so important in the West now. We don't realize how important it is, how we switch, how we come back to the story movement, and even in the West, we've forgotten. We think we're still on propositions. Yeah, there is a bunch of that, but the younger you go, the more story oriented you will be.
Well, Tom, man, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for all your work and for how you'd opened my eyes to different avenues of this conversation. And man, it's just a delight to talk with you.
No, that's fun. I enjoyed it. And I enjoy your podcast that you put up there. We so need this.
Yeah. Well, thanks. Continue to tell all your friends about it.
Oh, yeah, and I'm doing it. I've done that.
All right. We'll talk to you later, Tom.
Okay. You take care. Bye-bye.